Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this Tantra Talks podcast. I'm James Gopala, your host. And the purpose of the podcast is to shed light on the meaning and the essence of Tantra, a term that is often misunderstood and misrepresented. So I'm very grateful and honored to welcome Simon Borg-Olivier to the show. Welcome, Simon.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here and talk about such an exciting subject.
Cheers, Simon. It's wonderful to have you on the show. Simon is one of the most experienced long-term standing yoga teachers in Australia, with over 50 years of experience. In 1984, Simon set up Yoga Synergy in Sydney, where he's been teaching yoga ever since. Simon has also trained in physiotherapy, in molecular biology, I understand. Is that correct, Simon?
Yep.
Brilliant. And lectures at university, and has really explored the science of yoga, the science of physiotherapy, the science of the body, the science of movement and breath, and how it all unites into an expression of yoga. And so, yeah, it's a great honor to be speaking with you, someone who has so much experience and someone who I highly respect. And yeah, there's much to learn from your wisdom and your experience. So Simon, I'd like to just start by talking about yoga and really what has happened it seems the last decade, arguably a little bit longer. There's been an explosion of yoga teacher training qualifications. It seems that everybody is studying now to be a yoga teacher. Here in Harrogate in North Yorkshire, we have one of the highest proportions of yoga teachers to population in the UK.
Yeah.
And clearly in 200 hours, it's very difficult to teach yoga. How do you feel about, I mean, originally 1980s, I imagine there wasn't many people teaching yoga, and you've had all this time to develop your knowledge as a yoga teacher. How do you feel about the current situation on planet Earth right now with the plethora of yoga teachers?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a bit of a conundrum inside me, because although I like the idea that everyone's into yoga, a lot of people, in my opinion, are not really doing yoga. They're doing exercise. It's like the aerobics of the 2000s. And there's almost like a twofold path to modern yoga. Because the way I see yoga, which I mean, most people think of as the word yoga meaning union, it's more like the resolution of paradox. So for me, yoga in two extreme forms, I could describe the physical aspect of yoga to be doing something which most people would look at and consider to be extremely stressful, but the person doing it is actually very, very relaxed. So maybe you might see someone doing yoga on Netflix, on Instagram rather, and it might look like they're doing a one-handed balance. And someone goes, oh, that looks really stressful. But that's yoga because it's meant to be relaxing at the same time. Invariably, though, most people doing these exercises are actually more stressed than they should be, which means all they're doing is doing a stressful activity in a stressful way, which is not that difficult. But if they were doing a stressful activity in a relaxing way, then I would call it closer to yoga. But that's hard to do. And then the other type of yoga, which is closer to what most people call meditation, is when they're doing something what looks really boring, like, sitting in a cold room, looking quite bored, uninterested, and getting cold. That many people go, that's meditation. But if they're sitting in a cold room and they're not bored and they're not cold, that's real meditation. Whereas if all you're doing is sitting in a cold room, getting cold and bored, that's just doing something boring, and being bored by it. So most people don't like yoga because it is too stressful for them. And most people don't like meditation because it's too boring. Whereas in fact, yoga and meditation should be the same thing. The art of possibly doing something which is seemingly stressful, but you're able to relax in, or seemingly boring, but you're able to remain excited in. And I would like to think of both of them as the same thing, yoga and meditation. And I have 5 prerequisites to call them real yoga or real meditation, that they are something which is sustainable. In other words, you could do them for several hours, so do the activity or the engagement for, say, several hours. So it's sustainable. And it's also engaging, meaning it's something you can put yourself in the present moment and be engaged in the activity. So subject and object become one, and you're, in that sort of non-default state of the brain. And then the third thing is it's got to have a calming effect. So you have a predominance of your parasympathetic nervous system over your sympathetic nervous system, meaning low heart rate, very low minute ventilation. Like, to look at the person who's in yoga or meditation, you'd think, gee, they're not even breathing, or their heart seems to be hardly racing. And then it also has to feel effortless. So there's no pain or discomfort or sense that it's going to have something that has to be stopped. And the most important thing is it must be something which is invigorating, i.e. it must be moving blood through the body. Hence you have the Tibetan yoga. I mean, my first traditional teacher was a Tibetan tantric yogi when I was 17. And he showed me a picture of this guy sitting naked in the snow. And he said, this guy's meditating, he's doing yoga. And I went, gee, that must be hard to be naked in the snow, melt the snow around you and be still so relaxed. So that to me is an important aspect of meditation, the ability to thermoregulate, so that your fingers should be as warm as your armpits. So you should be able to be in a really cold room and still be warm and not cover yourself with blankets like many people do in the West, or be in a really hot room and still be able to stay cool in a hot environment. And those things are just not present in the modern world. To me, after 50 years of practice, even longer if I want to count what my father taught me when I was 5 or 6 years old, I feel like I'm just beginning to understand it now, So say, for example, you mentioned teacher training courses of 200 hours each. I mean, I teach on many teacher training courses around the world, and at Yoga Synergy, we have our own. And the Yoga Alliance certification says you have to have at least 20 to 30 hours of anatomy training as a yoga teacher. But as a physiotherapist alone, I mean, it was my third university degree. In my physiotherapy degree alone, we had more than 3,000 hours of anatomy and physiology. And I'm still feeling like I've got so much more to learn about that. So how on earth can someone expect to help other people on a physical level in terms of their muscles and joints, on a physiological level in terms of their hormones, digestive, immune, reproductive system, as many yoga teachers aspire to do, and in terms of their mental body, as a psychologist might profess to teach? How can people as yoga teachers know everything you need to know as a doctor, a physiotherapist, and a psychologist, and learn that in 200 hours? Give me a break, So really, unfortunately, the whole topic of yoga teaching has been so watered down that in the modern world, most serious people do not take yoga teachers seriously, because how can anyone be that much of an expert with so little experience? That's the sad truth of it, even though I love the fact that everyone wants to do yoga.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I brought up some really important points there. I guess the yoga teacher training is just the beginning of the journey.
Should be.
And,
yes. Yeah.
I remember when I did my first training and started teaching, and I look back at what I was teaching there and such a limited understanding, and still growing and still learning, but going back and doing multiple other trainings, and it seems to be a never-ending journey of growth and understanding and evolution. You said something really interesting about how yoga, essentially, it may look difficult, but it should be effortless. You should be in a relaxed state. Equally with meditation, it may appear to be boring, but the practitioner should be in a state of full engagement and really in that beautiful state. Arguably, therefore, there has to be stress in the yoga process and boredom in the meditation process to get ultimately to those states of complete ease in the yoga practice and complete fulfillment in the meditation practice. Would you argue with that?
Possibly, but while there is still the stress or the boredom, there's not the yoga. So I think what the Western approach has been is a little bit too much of, they want to get there too quickly. And because of that rush to try and achieve what they think of as yoga, be an ultimate posture, an ultimate state of meditation, so quickly, most people, most Western-minded people, which is most of all of us, there's just a desire to achieve too much too quickly. And I think the best results will come when you start doing something repetitively and get comfortable doing it repetitively. And if I used the weightlifting uh, scenario as a model, for example, you can get a very good result in terms of strength training if you pick up a weight which is the heaviest possible weight that you can lift in one go. Say it's, I can lift up 100 kilos like this, lift it up and then put it back down. But after that, I'm so exhausted, I will not be able to pick up that weight again for a few days. But people say that amount of weight to pick up in one go is so stressful that it's potentially damaging physically, physiologically, and mentally. And it gives good results in terms of strength, but maybe not good results in other terms of aspects of the body, physiology, mentally, etc. And potentially you could damage joints. So they say that 9 repetition maximum is a better option, where if you pick a weight, which maybe instead of 100 kilos, it might be 60 or 70 kilos, you pick that weight up and it's easy the first time, harder the second, harder the third. By the time you get to 6th or 7th, you're going, this is difficult. And by the time it's the 9th one, you pick it up and you go, ah! And then after the 9th one, you cannot lift it again for a few days. That's called your 9 repetition maximum. And so the 9 repetition maximum is meant to be a little bit less risky physically and still give you reasonable results, but not as much as the 1 repetition maximum in terms of strength. I think that we should be looking towards doing practices which are more like a 1,000 repetition maximum, where the activity seems so easy that it's doable for long periods of time. And people will go, well, that's too easy. How are you going to get strong doing that? But actually, that's closer to natural life. That we do activities, like repetitive walking, squatting, sitting, the sort of lifestyle things that people did in traditional cultures, where they're done over and over and over again. But they're not seeming stressful, but traditional cultured people ended up being very, very, very strong. Another example might be, say, for example, in yoga, many people do push-ups. And a push-up, in terms of up dog, down dog, people get good enough at doing it. But if you talk to the average person, say a girl, if you say how many push-ups could you do, they might say 10. Often people will say 1 or 2 or 3. But then you go, well, push-ups are only one type of movement. They're going, it's mainly triceps work of pushing activity. Wouldn't it be more balanced? If we talk about yoga, we're talking about balance, aren't we? To also be able to do chin-ups. So as many push-ups as you do, you should also do chin-ups. But many modern yoga practitioners don't do much pulling exercise, they do pushing exercise. So I think a more balanced exercise is if you're doing 10 chin-ups, 10 push-ups, do 10 chin-ups. But if you have to stop at 10, it's not sustainable. You want to do an activity which is sustainable. So something like be able to do it 1,000 times, but we're not strong enough to do 1,000 push-ups or 1,000 chin-ups. But the same muscle that I would use to straighten my elbow up to the ceiling, like doing a Surya Namaskar to take the arms up, that's using my triceps, which uses the same muscle as the push-up. And if I start with my elbows bent and bend my elbows up toward my face, then that uses the same muscles I'd use for a chin-up. So if I choose instead to just start with my hands by the side of the body, bend my elbows to bring my hands toward my face, then raise my elbows above my head and straighten my arms, then I'm using the push-up muscle and the chin-up muscle in one movement. They're both completely easy. I don't feel stressed. I don't feel tensed. I can do it 1,000 times. And by doing it, I will get strength, but I won't feel tense. And I'll get flexibility because I'm mobilizing my joints, but I won't feel like I'm stretching. But I'll also get blood flow because those movements will make blood flow in a way where the pumping action of the biceps and triceps turning on and off and the reciprocal relaxation that takes place between those two muscles by simple nerve reflexes will cause blood to pump through the body and essentially turn my arms into a functional heart-like device that makes blood flow while keeping my heart rate low. And I think blood flow is more important for long-term health than having muscles which hypertrophy beyond the needs of our daily life, unless you specifically want to be a strong man.
Yeah, so you're not in the gym, Simon, flexing the muscles, lifting weights on a daily basis?
Very rarely. I mean, occasionally I'll do it for fun, but I think that 90% to 99% of our activities should be things which should be sustainable, And 1 to 10%, it's okay to push yourself so your heart races or your muscles feel overactive. But the idea of having 45 minutes 3 times a week where you get your heart rate to 160 beats per minute, or doing 3 or 4 times a week where you're feeling tension in all the muscles of your body while lifting weights, I think that's an invitation to cause stress in your system to the point of inhibiting immune function, digestive function, reproductive function. And actually, the whole process ends up making your body feel subconsciously like you're a failure. Because the modern approach to increasing strength and flexibility is one that you work till failure. So if you're doing your 9 repetition maximum, you're getting to that point where you go, the 9th one, I'm a failure, I can't do any more. So the subconscious mind, the subconscious of the body, which is 1 million times more powerful than our conscious mind, will actually be thinking you have failed. And if you were racing against a saber-toothed tiger, you would have died. So it feels like you're a failure. Whereas if you're doing something sustainably for a long period of time, subconsciously, you think you're succeeding. You think you're doing well. You think you're safe. So and same with stretching. As soon as you doing a stretching exercise with the aim that I want to get more flexible, for a start, you're not in the present moment. You're in some future time when you anticipate you will be flexible. In other words, you're not doing yoga for now. You're doing it for some future time. And as you feel a stretch in the body interprets that as something's wrong, a loss of freedom, because I can't go any further. And if I do go further, there's going to be pain. And if I go further still, there's going to be injury. It's like if I ask someone to say, cross your arms. If you cross your arms and you bend your elbows as far as you can to cross your arms, you might ask someone, are you feeling a stretch in your elbow? And they'll say, no. And you say, well, imagine if you did feel a stretch in your elbow as you bend your arms. The next thought would be, something must be wrong with my elbow. Well, our body thinks the same things. As soon as it feels a stretch, it thinks something's wrong. What we want is freedom, freedom of movement without the feeling of stretch. And most people in the world of modern yoga are overstretching, over-tensing, over-breathing, over-making their heart race. And they're either overthinking, which becomes stressful, or not thinking at all when perhaps they should, because otherwise they're going to damage their knee or their hip or their back or their neck, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love the differentiation between the movement and the stretch. And arguably, no stretch should be static, that there is always some sort of movement with the breath, on the inhale to release, on the exhale to go deeper. I mean, say, for example, you're teaching a typical like one-legged forward bend, Janu Shirshasana. Are you encouraging movement with the stretch, or is it something that you just won't teach because it appears to be on one level a more static stretch? For example, if I'm teaching this position, I'll encourage a sort of a pulsation, almost an inhale to lift out, exhale to go a little bit deeper, inhale to lift up, exhale, as opposed to just that static, just pulling yourself closer. Is that the kind of thing that you're teaching as a teacher?
I can, but I find that usually if I start teaching with the breath, there's a lot going on with the breath that most people won't understand or resonate with. And mostly as soon as you start teaching anything to do with breath to anyone but the most experienced practitioner, they over tense and they over breathe. And so if you can avoid that and don't overtense, don't overbreathe, and breathe from the right places, you can use breathing very effectively to move deeper in and out of postures. But I find that for most people, if you say, even take a little breath in, they'll breathe more than they would be normally, which means they're overbreathing. And if you say, take a deep breath in, they usually go up into their chest, whereas a deep breath is usually down into their pelvic floor. But if you really do breathe deeply right into the pelvic floor or right down into the deep parts of the body and access the diaphragm as a key place which has a junction between the conscious and the unconscious mind, because it can be controlled by the conscious mind, as we do if we say make a breath in, and by the unconscious mind, which is what you do when you're asleep, when you breathe diaphragmatically. That's what makes it a bridge between conscious and unconscious. Whereas, of course, chest breathing doesn't have that. If you breathe in your chest when you're asleep, it's because you're not sleeping properly. But deep diaphragmatic breathing is one where you can access your unconscious and thereby triggering a control of your nervous system and perhaps accessing reflexes that often make certain muscles over tense. If that's the case and you're doing that, you can use the breath and perhaps you're able to do that. But I doubt that you could teach beginners that. I think if you teach beginners, you're probably better off most of the time just teaching them natural breathing. And natural breathing is the invisible, inaudible breath where you inhale low, exhale passively, breathe through the nose, don't think too much about it, and generally just minimal breathing. That's something which I find works better for most people. Otherwise, if you say exhale fully, they lock their spine. Deep breath in will make their chest elevate because they've inhibited their diaphragm, and a deep breath out will make their forced muscles of abdominal exhalation lock their core with their oblique muscles in a way that their spine no longer can move. And then they inhibit their digestive system, immune system, reproductive system, and turn off their parasympathetic dominance.
So you'd be happy to teach a static stretch, but just encourage the natural breathing to avoid any.
Yeah, but you see, if I'm calling it a stretch, if they're feeling a stretch, I'll call that a stretching exercise. I won't call it yoga. And I find there's just much better ways of increasing flexibility than passive static stretches. So
encourage movement, a more movement-based class, which is more fluid, which may
possibly
have some asana qualities. And
if my aim, for example, is to get someone to get more flexibility bending forward, then the two most important movements, or two most important principles I'll use will be to activate the antagonists of the muscles that I'm stretching. So you often hear things like pull up your kneecap when you're doing a forward bend, because pulling up the kneecap activates the quadriceps or the knee extensor muscles, which will reciprocally relax the hamstrings or the knee flexor muscles. So by tightening the front of your thigh, it sends a nerve reflex that tells the back of your thigh to relax. But if you physically tell someone, pull up your kneecaps, they'll do it and they'll become tense even in their face. And then if they stop tensing their kneecap, if they stop relaxing their face, if they relax their face, they'll probably stop tightening their kneecap muscles. So I find it's better, rather than tell someone tighten a muscle in order to facilitate a stretch, I will make them engage a muscle. So in other words, you could do something like, if it's the hamstring you're specifically trying to lengthen, rather than let someone drop with gravity toward their knee, which will stimulate a stretch reflex because it's an external force, the force of gravity lengthening the knee, the same way a hammer hits the front of a knee at a doctor's surgery. You activate the quadriceps by making them lift their leg up in the air. And in the Ashtanga Vinyasa practice, there's that Padangusthasa thing where you hold the foot in the air, then you let go of it in the fourth one. Most people's foot drops right down, right? That pose is actually quite an important pose because it gives people the idea that you're supposed to match strength with flexibility.
Absolutely.
And if strength and flexibility are not matched, then it usually means you're overstretching, and that becomes problematic. So I believe that most people are overdoing the flexibility part without the balancing stretch. So in the beginning, for me, active movements are the key. So you only move as far into a stretch as the body will go there with its own muscles of its own volition. So that active movement will cause the activation of the antagonist, which turns off the antagonist, the opposite muscle which lengthens, and a muscle which is relaxed and lengthened does not feel like a stretch anywhere near a muscle that is lengthened and tense. And most passive poses are lengthened but tense by the stretch reflex. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Oh, yeah. I understand what you're saying. It's difficult to necessarily see it in practice. I understand what you mean about lifting
without examples.
Working the hip flexors and the quads, and that will strengthen them to help then go into the hamstring stretch, the back of the leg. But yeah,
it's a poor example in some ways, because if you make someone tense the hip flexors too much, which also will help in forward bends, many modern people end up with hip problems because most people's hip flexors are too tight already from sitting in chairs for too long. So that becomes a compounded problem, that we're not dealing with natural bodies in a natural world. We're dealing with very stuffed up unnatural bodies. People have been sitting on chairs for a long time whose hip flexors are way too tight, their lower back muscles are way too tight, their core is held in too much. They're told by the media to pull their navel toward their spine in a dysfunctional way, pull their shoulders back and down, and keep them back and down in modern yoga classes in a way which actually stuffs up their breathing as well. Even sitting on a chairs will stuff up your breathing because the psoas muscle at the front of the hip is so contracted in most average people that when they stand up, the psoas, which joins onto your diaphragm, pulls the diaphragm downwards, meaning then the diaphragm is never able to come to its relaxed position. So they're always in a place of inhale and never able to exhale, which means their diaphragm becomes dysfunctional when they're walking around and they breathe into their chest. And that's the people you're dealing with who walk into their first yoga class. So as soon as you tell them to do any breathing, it's just going to get worse, not better.
It's challenging. And I guess
Really challenging.
You know, your job is to lead the student through a non-stressful experience where they can be gradual progression, lengthening and an opening and a strengthening, but for it not to appear stressful or not to the experience to be stressful, to make it as natural and for them to be as embodied as possible. And it's I guess that.
And I think part of the problem is that people associate yoga as being to become as strong and flexible as the typical Indian yogi, forgetting that that typical Indian yogi probably could already do lotus posture and stick their leg behind their head and certainly squat before they even heard the word yoga before they went to their first class. Whereas in the West, you know, most people cannot even cross their legs properly. The average Indian yogi is flexible because their lifestyle makes them flexible. Not the yoga poses are not stretches for them. And, you know, so as an experienced yoga teacher, probably for yourself, certainly for me, if I bend forward in Janushirasana, this one-legged forward bend, and I touch my head to my knee, the beginner will say to me, oh, that looks like a good hamstring stretch. And I'll go, no, I'm just resting my head on my knee. Mm-hmm. They think it's a stretch. And so their aspiration will be, they must get a stretch out of this. Mm-hmm. So there's this confusion they have in their aim. They think they won't get yoga until they get a stretch, whereas yoga is just a state of mind. And part of it's just saying happiness is a choice, not something you wait for. And if you're aspiring for anything in the future, then you're probably going to miss the point. And the very first mention of the word yoga in the text was in the Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna was talking to Krishna, and he's saying, I'm going to go kill my enemies who are my cousins, and what should I do? And Krishna says, Karmani evadi karaste mapa. He says, don't be attached to the fruits of your actions. Be rather engaged in those actions themselves. Don't be attached to either success or failure, but don't become attached to laziness either. And he says that's the balance that we call yoga. You know, so once you start thinking, I'm doing yoga to get flexible, I'm doing yoga to get strong, you miss the yoga completely.
And when we look at yoga in the context of Tantra, you know, yoga, Hatha yoga being an evolution from the Tantra of North India, or that was spread throughout India in the Common Era. And you have the original Hatha yogis like Matsyendranath and Gorkanath, which arguably came from the non-dualistic tantric Kashmir Shaivism tradition. And they really incorporated the philosophy into the physical practice, albeit the focus was very much on the physical, on the breath, on the cleanses, and they kind of cut out a lot of the ritual and arguably also the deeper philosophy. And when we talk about Tantra in the context of yoga, or yoga in the context of Tantra, like, how do you understand this term Tantra? There's so often misused, and obviously you have this neo-Tantra and people are doing all this tantric sex and things like that. For someone who's experienced yoga such depth and has such a sound understanding of the tradition, how do you understand its roots from Tantra, and what is Tantra?
Okay, so I'm not a Sanskrit scholar or a Shaivite master, but my understanding after having studied a mixture of all these things is that when we talk dualistic or non-dualistic philosophies, there is this idea that in the non-dualistic philosophies, there is, if we had to use the model of God as a model, say, for example, there is us and there is God. If we use God as a principle, for example. So when we're in a non-dualistic philosophy, we'd say we are separate to God, but our aspiration is to become one with God. Or in the yoga terms, they'd say, well, there's our individual consciousness and there's the universal consciousness, and that our aspiration in yoga is to become one with the universal consciousness. That to me is a more dualistic idea. But the non-dualistic idea says our individual consciousness and the universal consciousness are already one. We are one with the universal consciousness, meaning we are one with God already. And all we've got to do to get yoga is just realize it and act like it. And that to me really embodies Tantra. To me, that's what Tantra is saying on the most important level. I mean, there's many different parts of it, but that also means to me, like I mentioned to you in an earlier talk, that Tantra embodies everything. There is no good and bad. Tantra encompasses all things. So in the West, we have this notion that light and dark are two opposing forces. And like in Star Wars, we have the light forces and the dark forces. But actually, the dark force in Tantra is equivalent to the womb of the mother, which is a dark place, and the baby comes from that darkness out into the light. The dark place is the earth where the roots of a tree or a plant are growing, which is dark, and it comes out to the light. But neither is bad or good. They're both part of this yin yang in the Chinese philosophy, or ha and ta, because yin and yang are like ha and ta. And so to me, Tantra recognizes that ha and ta come together, and it's the resolution of opposites. So ha and ta, hatha, mean force. The word hatha meant force. And many people see the word force and put it next to the word yoga and go, oh, that must mean you must force yourself into positions. Whereas the way I see it is that the text of Goraknath back in the 10th century, that's the only place I managed to find the meanings of the word ha and ta. And, you know, almost every yoga practitioner knows in the modern world that ha and ta are supposedly meaning sun and moon. True, no, but you won't find that in a Sanskrit dictionary. You have to go back to the text of Goraknath to find out that allegorically sun and moon mean ha and ta. And that's why the word hatha is a hieroglyphic word. Sanskrit's a hieroglyphic language, meaning that like the hieroglyphics of Egypt, every picture had a meaning. And when you put two pictures next to each other, you get a compound meaning. Whereas some languages, each sound has a meaning. And so when you put two sounds together, you get a compound meaning. So for example, in Japanese, I know they have one sound for a house, one sound for a woman. And when you put the sound for house and woman together, you get a housewife, which is a wife, you know, which is a little bit sexist sounding maybe to a Western person, but the same thing is true in Sanskrit. So the word hatha in the context of yoga, which means union, ha and ta means sun and moon. Well, how does sun and moon relate to force? Well, ha is related to sun, meaning heat, which relates to high pressure. And ta relates to the opposite of heat, which is lack of heat or coolness, which relates to low pressure. Because when you increase pressure, you increase heat. When you decrease pressure, you decrease heat. So actually, heat and coolness and pressure relate to force, because force per unit of area is pressure. So what we have inside the body is the idea of yoga is the circulation of energy and information through the body. I'd say good energy and loving information, but that good energy and loving information circulates through the nadis as prana and chitta in the form of all the things that we know prana and chitta to be, you know. And so that prana and chitta will be moved not just by the heart. The heart is just one means of pumping these energies through the body. It's the least most effective. That's why in the yoga texts, you're often hearing that the yogi counts their life not by the number of years they live, but by the number of beats their heart makes or the number of breaths they take. So in my writing, I've tried to elaborate 11 other ways that the body uses to move blood through the body, all of which use this system of ha and ta, the ability to create regions of high pressure inside the body, heart regions, and regions of low pressure inside the body, cooler regions, low pressure regions. And so the low pressure region will pull blood toward that area. High pressure regions push blood toward that area. So these mechanisms include the use of what we would call asana, vinyasa, pranayama, but really they're things like the musculoskeletal pump, the gravitational pump, the respiratory pump. These things, centripetal pumps inside the body, external pressure pumps, all of which can move blood through the body and move prana and chitta through the nadis. And so when we do this, then hatha yoga becomes a science. And hatha yoga is what's called the right side of Tantra. Tantra is the embracing of all things and the realization that we're all connected as one. But that realization for many people is too much. And so one expression of Tantra, which I really resonated with, was that if Tantra is everything, we should be able to encompass everything, including things that for most people are too gross. And so there's 5 things in Tantra they call the 5 M's, which in Sanskrit, they're words that all start with the letter M, like Matsya, meaning fish, Mithuna, which is to do with, I can never pronounce these things properly, but to do with sexual intercourse. Mimamsa, I think, I forget them all, Mamsa. But anyway, there are 5 things, meaning fish, meat, mudra is another one, meaning, well, we know mudra to be mudras of the energy controlling systems of yoga, but mudra is actually parched grain. And then madhya is meaning wine or different types of fermented products. And what it says is that these things, which essentially are sex, alcohol, cooked grain or drugs, meat and fish, are things that they'll kill most people. But if you're an evolved and adept yogi, you'll be able to survive them all and you should be able to embrace them. And so what it says then is that most normal people shouldn't do these things, especially things like really outrageous sexual things, really outrageous decadent food things. But all of the tantric yogis I met in India would do this. They would happily drink a whole bottle of alcohol and talk lucidly, drink snake poison, talk lucidly. I mean, some of my teachers would talk about having sexual interaction with corpses in the burial grounds. You know, one of my teachers said one of his favorite foods was eating puris fried in human brain fat, because this is not considered going, it's horrible sounding. This is not considered going against ahimsa because these animals, these people are already dead. The vehicle of our body is not our soul. And so once someone has naturally passed away, what happens to that vehicle doesn't matter. That's if you really understand Tantra. But for most people, it's too much. So they say, look, the left-hand side of Tantra is just too difficult for most people to deal with. The idea that you could have sex with a corpse, the idea that you could take very deadly drugs or alcohol, or even eat meat or fish, or even cooked grains, which could be interpreted as psychedelic drugs. All these, the interpretations are there that these 5 M's of Tantra could be things like psychedelic drugs, alcohols, meat, which could be as much as dead human flesh, and fish, and also the other one, I forget what it was, sexual intercourse, right? So what they say is, let's do a nice accessible form of Tantra, which we're going to call the right side of Tantra. And we're going to be able to give that to more people with a little bit less people flipping out. Because most people, if you give them the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, they're just going to flip out. So let's call this right side of Tantra Hatha yoga, where they deal with these forces of Ha and Ta. And we're going to give the substitute for mudra, which literally means cooked grains, which could be parched grains, which could be the ergots creating psychedelic drugs. And we're going to substitute it with these mudras, Yan mudra, Shakti Chalani Prana mudra, like Nabu mudra, Kechari mudra, simple things like this. And then people can do that. And then instead of sexual intercourse, which could cause problems like having undesirable children or stuff like this, let's talk about the union between the Shiva and the Shakti inside people's body, creating the Kundalini, the Shakti energy to rise up to the crown chakra. And we'll talk about that for the right side of Tantra, Hatha Yoga. And instead of Madhya, we talk about wine. Let's talk about draining the soma, the fluid from the pineal gland of the third eye, and letting that be drunk, provided it doesn't get destroyed by the gastric fires, which of course has relationship to DMT and things like ayahuasca and not being able to eat it, but you can mix it with a special drug that it makes it that makes it accessible for us to use. And then of course there is mamsa, which is this idea of eating meat. Well, in the Hatha Yoga they talk about swallowing the tongue, which is representative of the meat. And of course, if you can't eat fish, what are you going to do? Instead, you drink from the rivers inside the body, which are your nadis, and they're the nadis which the prana flows in. So the prana becomes the fish, the rivers in your body are the nadis. See, the Hatha Yogi won't eat fish, they'll do pranayama. The Hatha Yogi won't eat meat, they swallow the tongue. The Hatha Yogi won't have sex, they'll make union inside themselves. The Hatha yogi won't drink wine, they drink the soma inside their body. The Hatha yoga won't take psychedelic drugs and eat cooked grains. They will do mudra.
Wow.
This is quite something, I think.
Yeah, that's phenomenal.
But it's the right side of Tantra. It's funny because then at the same time they're talking about Hatha, they talk about Ashtanga yoga, and many people think Ashtanga yoga is different to Hatha yoga, whereas of course Ashtanga yoga is a philosophical treatise, whereas Hatha yoga is the physical practice of Ashtanga yoga, vinyasa yoga that people do today. But the philosophy is that of Ashtanga yoga as the treatise. And many people will argue, they'll say, is Ashtanga yoga as the sutras of Patanjali, is that a dualistic or non-dualistic philosophy? And of course, the answer is it's probably both, because you can't have dualism without non-dualism. They both work together. And that's part of the embracing of Tantra, because in many ways, Tantra is both dualism and non-dualism at the same time. Because it's neither, dualism or dualistic. It's embracing of everything.
Wow,
Weird,
thank
huh?
you. that was awesome to have that. I've never looked at it like that in that way, and that's really really enlightening. Thank you so much for sharing that. And in terms of the Hatha yoga tradition and working with the cleansers, the Chakras, and obviously we've talked about pranayama. Is that something that you think is really important on the yoga path, to work with all these different elements of the Hatha yoga tradition?
Yes. Because in the modern world today, there's this big push for Ashtanga yoga. I mean, like Bianca Matchless, my business partner. She's been, her and I have worked together for 30 years. She's, one of the best yoga teachers I've ever met. And she's also an exercise-based physiotherapist. And we created a style together, which we call Yoga Synergy. And it was essentially, for us, a fusion between our understanding of the traditional systems that we learned from India and other countries, along with our understanding as physiotherapists. It's a synergy between ourselves, an understanding of how you can possibly fuse the wisdom that is given to a traditional body that's brought up in a traditional culture, where you sit cross-legged and you squat to go to the toilet, carry things on your head, and merge that into a body which is sitting on chairs 15 hours a day. It was that type of synergy. And we thought it was a very intelligent thing to do, because most people cannot do Ashtanga yoga in the way that, say, Pattabhi Jois gave it to, people from the 1970s onwards in the West, because their bodies were just not ready for it. And so a lot of people would then say to us, they would come to our school, learn Yoga Synergy, and then think that was a prerequisite to learn Ashtanga. And as if like the Ashtanga was the ultimate pinnacle of what they're trying to do. But really, it's probably not suitable for most people. But what is important to understand, that this Ashtanga path, this philosophical treatise, which is all about yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dhanana, dhyana, samadhi, this is mostly philosophy. Very little is said about, asana, sthira sukham asanam, be firm but calm. Keep doing it until it becomes effortless, then all dualities will cease. Now you're ready for pranayama. And now with pranayama, you've got three parts: breathe in, breathe out, don't breathe. Be concerned about time and place, and also make sure it's fine, minute. And then now there is a fourth place, a place where you don't breathe, but it doesn't feel like you're not breathing. Okay, now you're ready for meditation. That's it. It's not saying much physical, really. But then what we need for doing the Ashtanga yoga practice, which is the physical form of what most, 90% of people doing what they call yoga in the world today, is Hatha yoga. And Hatha yoga is also known as Saptanga yoga. And Ashtanga means 8 limbs, Saptanga means 7 limbs. And the 7 limbs of Saptanga yoga, or aka Hatha yoga, or the right side of Tantra, are 1, Kriya, or Shatkriya, Shatkarma, the 6 purification processes. Number 2 is asana, which is the physical form of the exercise. 3 is mudra, which is the physical form plus energy flowing through it. And then the 4th one is pranayama, which is something beyond energy. It's something to do with a little bit more than just breath, because the ultimate pranayama is not breathing at all. And then there's Dhananda Dhyana Samadhi. So this first stage of Kriya is very, very important because it's often completely ignored in most Hatha Yoga classes. And in the world of Hatha Yoga, in the world of Ashtanga Yoga or most modern yoga, a lot of people misunderstand things like Mula Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha. And Bandha, Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha, the most two commonly known, are actually subsets of Mudra. But Mudra is the third stage of Saptanga Yoga. Already you have to have had learned asana, and before that you have to have learned Kriya. And one of the Kriyas or Shat Kriyas is Nauli. And Nauli is actually Uddiyana Bandha, the ability to expand the chest without breathing, and then isolate the rectus abdominis and the oblique muscles separately, individually in a rolling circle. And having done that for a period of time, such that you're not breathing for a whole period of time. And that's meant to be the prerequisite before you even start asana. So, I mean, you're already, by modern terms, if you could do Nauli, you're already an advanced pranayama person in the modern world. Yet for real yoga, it's a prerequisite even before doing asana. Another one is Bhasti Kriya. Bhasti Kriya is so underrated, but what Bhasti Kriya involves, and anyone who's out there can try this, it's the ability to expand the anal mouth while expanding your abdomen and then trying to expand the chest. And so if anyone wishes to try this simple exercise, maybe you and I can try it now. If you do this simple thing, you breathe into your abdomen till you make your abdomen swell and expand like a baby's belly, and then let the air come out by itself, and it feels quite relaxing. It's what you do in your most regenerative cycle we call sleep. Okay, it's an inhale passively to the abdomen and an exhale passively. But the belly will expand if you keep breathing in. Then you say to yourself, well, what about breathing out? What happens when you exhale passively is the air does not come fully out. If you want to get the air fully out, you have to squeeze it out. So to squeeze it out really strongly, try this. Try tighten the pelvic floor, which will help you engage all your abdominal muscles, and then squeeze the abdomen in till you've got no more air in your lungs, and make the abdomen firm and tight, and keep the abdomen sucked in tight. And then with the abdomen sucked in tight, try and breathe into your firm abdomen. And then you'll find that probably, if the way most people do it is, you can no longer breathe in your abdomen, and it feels quite stressful. And then you might say, well, how do people breathe with a firm abdomen? Are they just breathing in the chest? Well, there is the way that you can actually breathe into the chest with your abdomen firm, but still be calmly able to breathe into the abdomen. And this is the secret of Sthira Sukham Asanam, which is the sutra in Patanjali. But now I'll say to you, take a breath into the chest. So take a deep breath into the chest, make your chest expand, which almost everyone can do. You see it done in every class. But then it surprises people when you say that actually 9 out of 10 people cannot really breathe into the chest unless they do it in a dysfunctional way. So we don't want to do breathing in the chest in a stressful way, because stress is the opposite of yoga, really, in many ways. No? So first of all, relax your abdomen like you did before. Let it expand and soften. Relax the pelvic floor like it would be, unless you're trying to stop a diarrhea attack. And then with your pelvic floor expanded and relaxed as much as you can comfortably make it, your abdomen expanded as relaxed as much as you can comfortably make it. Now keep them relaxed and expanded, and now try and breathe into your chest. And notice the chest does not breathe in as much at all for the average person. That's what most people will find out. But now tighten your pelvic floor, tighten the abdomen, and now breathe into the chest. And when you do that, the chest will expand. But it expands in a way which a few seconds ago is a result of what we did to make ourselves stressed, which means that most people's chest breathing comes as a result of turning off your diaphragm and actually putting you to a state of flight or fight. Bhasti is the Kriya which says, do this. Expand the pelvic floor, make it as big and open like you're about to go to the toilet, but not. Then expand the abdomen, fill the abdomen with air. Then with both abdomen and pelvic floor open, now breathe into the chest. And most people will go, nah, I can't do it. And actually the Kriya itself is meant to be done with no air in your lungs. So you're meant to do, the real Kriya is you do Uddiyana Bandha, which is the chest expansion, Nauli at the same time, open the anal mouth and then suck water into your anus by virtue of the negative pressure that comes. Most people can't do it. But to really do bhasti is something which is a prerequisite of asana, the ability to expand the chest, which is like what most people say is opening the heart chakra. But you can't open your heart chakra until you first open your abdominal chakra, before first opening your Svadhisthana chakra, before first opening your Muladhara chakra. So most people, when they're opening their chest, are like filling up, when you fill a glass of water, you have to fill the bottom of the glass before you fill the top. But most people in their bodies, with the energy of their chakras, are filling the top of the glass because they're emptying the bottom. It's not a full glass. They're just destroying their Muladhara, Svadhisthana, Manipura to open the heart center. And that just kills the very purpose of Hatha Yoga, because you've completely lost Kriya at that point.
Wow. Where did you learn this in terms of
This is, well, I've had real yoga teachers, because the real yoga teachers that I've had, I mean, there's one you can Google if you like. His name is Professor Bhim Dev, Bhim Dev. And if you want to look at the one video that's still available of him on the internet, because he was my teacher in the early 80s and I highly respect him. He would not only be able to breathe into his chest. I mean, for me, I can breathe into my neck. And I mean, try this for a second. I mean, anyone can try it, but be gentle. Put your fingers against your throat and push your fingers into your throat. And what most people will find is it's uncomfortable, doesn't feel nice. So I forgot to say that. So what you want to do first is tighten the muscles in your throat first, then push your fingers in your throat. But I forgot to say there are no muscles there. So it still doesn't feel nice. So what you can do is you learn to bring prana into your Vishuddhi chakra. So what I can do to a limited extent is I could get you to do it. Many people do it to me. They push their fingers or even a stick into my throat, and then I inhale first into Muladhara, then fill up Muladhara, then fill up Svadhisthana, then fill up my abdomen, then fill up my chest, then fill up more prana, more air, and bring air pressure into my throat. And then I can just push fingers away. I can push someone away from me, but my teachers can bend iron bars.
Wow.
And Professor Bhim could go one step further, and instead of just filling up in this bhasti-like fashion to fill up Muladhara, Svadhisthana, Manipura, Anahata, and Vishuddhi, he'll fill up his third eye center. And he can put a metal bar, which is 2 meters long, as thick as your thumb, which I cannot bend over my thigh. He'll put it on his eyeball and bend it with his eyeball. And I used to help him do it on stage.
Wow.
And this is how I understood the possibility of what Kriya really means, and what true complete breathing really means. And prana is a lot of things. What it is not so much of is oxygen. Prana is about air pressure, especially apana and the other pranas inside the body, because there's 5 types of prana. One is prana and one is called apana. One is, samana vyana, this sort of stuff. But prana is the one that comes into the lungs. But in other parts of the body, it's things like apana. So for example, Mayurasana is this posture where you balance on your elbow, but your abdomen is completely soft. And of course, many people think they should firm their abdomen. I've seen many anatomy textbooks, anatomy of yoga, where they say in Mayurasana, the abdominal muscles are held firm. And I go, you might have written this book, but you don't actually practice Mayurasana, because the abdominal muscles in Mayurasana are totally relaxed. And so when they're completely relaxed, you breathe into the abdomen, and that will actually give you the air pressure that will actually keep you bouncing off the ground. But once you learn how to bring that air pressure into any, you can bring it to any part of your body. My teachers can bring it into their arms. They can make one arm hotter than the other. They can make one arm thicker than the other by increasing blood flow and air pressure and blood pressure inside different parts of the body. This is the mastery of yoga, the ability to move what I'll call good energy and loving information through the body, so they can move blood wherever they like in their body while staying calm, not using a heart.
Wow. I mean, that is the the very advanced teachings of Hatha Yoga, you'd argue.
Yeah.
Maybe the
Yes.
original
Yes.
yogis 1,000 years ago or so, or even before,
Yes.
were practicing. And I think those kind of teachings in modern yoga are few and far between, if it's, if just a drop in the ocean of yoga that's taught now. So that's phenomenal. I think there's so much knowledge that you have, Simon, and so much for you to share. And I could talk to you for hours on this because I find it absolutely fascinating. But I don't want to take too much more of your time. But what I would be interested in, just kind of to close, is the concept of chakras. I know chakras obviously is a large topic, but you've looked at the yogic concepts very much in a Western scientific understanding, which I really like, because that's important to have that understanding and to communicate that to a Western audience as well. And just to understand that this isn't all mumbo jumbo, weird occult kind of teachings, that this is science, but maybe originally the language wasn't quite there. And in the modern era, we have the ability to understand it more in a technical or a scientific or a Western framework. So how do you understand the chakras in your mind, in your understanding?
There's many ways you could possibly approach it, and the simplest way perhaps is to say a chakra is a junction point where the nadis or the energy channels in the body will come like a main railway station. So for example, if we have, I think, are you in London?
North England, so Yorkshire.
Yeah. Okay, Yorkshire. Okay, so like say England has a whole set of railway lines, and every main city has a central railway. And some of the bigger cities will have many different lines which crisscross, but they'll all come to their central railway, and then they'll dissipate out. Those cities which have central railways, we could call them the chakra points. But in the center of England, or in the middle, the most important part of England in terms of the railway network would be London. And London has the central railway. So the chakras are the intersection points of many nadis. And the nadis are energy and information carrying conduits, which some are more subtle than others. So nadis include blood vessels, nerves, acupuncture meridians, lymphatic vessels, let's say, and acupuncture, blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, and acellular flow of, things like RNA, DNA, etc. And so these things, they merge in different places in the body, and usually a chakra point, the main chakra points, are also places where there is a nerve plexus and an endocrine gland. So the 7 main chakras they talk about in the center of the body all contain these nerve plexus and a network, the plexus is a network, and these endocrine glands. So for example, around the heart chakra, there is the cardiac nerve plexus and the thymus gland. Around the throat chakra, there is the thyroid gland and the thyroid, what's it called? The brachial plexus is one of the nerve plexes. And each has a nerve network and a gland. And around the rest of the body, there's, in some texts, they talk about 108 smaller chakras through the body, or some texts say 144 smaller chakra points. And these are usually the intersection points between 2 acupuncture meridians. And this was taught to me by people in India, and also reiterated by people in China as well. But another way of looking at it is the idea that the chakra points are these the main stations, but what you want is your energy and information to flow through your chakras. And some people erroneously think that the aim is to activate the chakras, whereas another way of looking at it is the aim is to dissolve the chakras. And a dissolved chakra is one where the train does not stop. You see, normally if a train has to travel through, if it's a slow train, it stops at every village and it takes forever to get there. But if it's a through train, it only stops at the major stations. But if it's a really good train, it will go straight from London to Northern England without stopping at any of the stations. That means all the main chakra points have been bypassed and there's no blockage, because a chakra point you consider as a blockage. Now, the ultimate end of this is that where's the most important chakra? Where is London in the body? The main energy center is the khandha. And the khandha is very rarely mentioned in any of the modern yoga texts. You hear about Manipura, you hear about Swadhisthana, but directly between Manipura and Swadhisthana is a place they call the khandha. And it's more understood in other traditional cultures because the khandha is the origin of 72,000 nadis. It's the place between Manipura and Swadhisthana. It's just in front of the L5S1 junction. It's the place where all movement should start from. In the West, we call it the lower abdomen. In the West, it's known as the central point around which the enteric nervous system, the gut-brain, surrounds. It's also where 80% of your immune system, digestive system, reproductive system surround. And this is the place where in China we know to be the Dantian. In Japan, we know to be the Tanden as the center of the hara. Dandon in Korea. In indigenous Australian cultures near where I live, they call it the Nadu Kuru. And it's where all movement should start from. And the biggest mistake you hear people talking about in Western modern exercise and Western modern yoga is that you should engage your core, you should lock your core. No, you should move from your core. You should breathe from your core, which really in the simplest way of saying it is for the beginner, breathe naturally, move naturally. When you become natural, then that's the step that progresses from a normal dysfunctional body to a natural childlike body. Then once you've mastered natural, you can progress to the supernatural that allows you to enter the third stage of the Siddha practices of the Ashtanga third chapter, where they talk about the siddhi powers, the supernatural powers. But before you go supernatural, go natural. We're normal people living in an unnatural world.
Very true. And that's why these practices are more relevant than ever to help us navigate through this crazy world that we're living in. Simon, thank you so much for sharing your time today. It's been really enlightening. I've learned so much, and I feel you have such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just very grateful for you being here and sharing this with us. Simon, how can people get in contact with you? I know you do a lot of online courses, which I'm sure people would really benefit from. So what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Oh, look, if you go to simonborg-olivier.com, I have a newsletter which I send out. And you can also, once you register, I can also send you a complimentary package of some of my writing and also some of my video practices. And we also have yogasynergy.com, which also has a newsletter. And we have online courses and things, which some of which you pay for, some of which are free. But I'd love to connect with people. And if I can finish by saying a couple of things first, maybe about the simplicity of it. I think once it starts becoming stressful or uncomfortable, you're missing the yoga. I think what we want is to go back to simple and natural. And often many people are looking towards an end goal in terms of strength and flexibility, whereas what you want is to feel comfortable. And for many people, they get better yoga practice by going for a walk, by going for a dance, by moving freely, by playing with their children, than they do doing some of the more stressful practices that many people call Hatha yoga. And these practices, although they may give some benefits in terms of mobility in the long term, they often cause long-term problems in the immune system, digestive, reproductive. It mustn't feel stressful. It must be for me, I say to my students, make your practice so it feels like you're in a warm bath being massaged by someone who really loves you. And if you can't do that to yourself, then how's anyone else going to do it for you, So make it simpler. And in the beginning, if it's about breathing, just breathe naturally. And if it's about movement, don't do anything which hurts. Make it sustainable, make it fun. And, in terms of your life, we want to find a life which we can enjoy. Because when you enjoy it and you look after your body, it's so much easier to help other people enjoy their lives. And if you can help other people enjoy their lives while enjoying your own, that's when we can start to connect. And to connect with someone, you have to connect by sharing good energy and loving information. Otherwise, no one listens to you. But if you connect within yourself with energy, good energy and loving information, that's a model you can share with the world. But if your practice becomes stressful, uncomfortable, and exhausting, what do you have to share with the world but that message? So make your own practice one where you share good energy and loving information inside yourself. Use that as a model to share with the world. And then I think people will really start to recognize that we are all connected as one, and that yoga is not something we look for. It's something we should be realizing and living in. We live in an ocean of love. That is the world we live in. And so we should act like it.
Oh, beautiful. Beautiful. Simon, thank you so much. Pranam.
It's such a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for inviting me. I can see that what you have is a massive wisdom, and you're sharing it in the most wonderful way. And thank you for humbling me by having me on your program.
Cheers.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Simon. Thank you.
Mm.